Hello to all of you, welcome. Tonight we get to enjoy the second lecture in our Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series to be delivered by Benjamin Zweig. My co-organizer for this series, Professor Stephen Whiteman, will give you his full and proper introduction, but I will begin by introducing this year's lecture series. The Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series itself was first established in 1989, which makes it a quite deeply rooted history here at the Courtauld itself. For this year's series, Art History at the Crossroads of Computer Vision, we were centering our thinking on evaluating and rethinking how our relationship with the past is connected to our relationship to ever-changing technologies. For those of you who attended the first lecture of the year a couple weeks back, you will recall that I struggled mightily with how to articulate that X in our title. The art history X, computer vision, which I decided on should be at the crossroads of. As something that felt more expansive than mere collaboration, something that allowed for possibilities and for change, welcome. For a spectrum of feelings, concerns, and even hopes about how we interact or intersect with technology. And tonight's lecture promises to expand that thinking further with an additional perspective on art history at the crossroads of computer vision, as we continue to think through how we think through the past. Just a reminder that next week, on December 9th, we will have Lumia Belfrige talking about the medieval antecedents that inflect our sense of how machines work. And on December 16th, Anna Naslund will explore how digital infrastructures and platforms structure scholarly thinking about images and their implications. So please do join us for that as well. But now I will turn to Professor Stephen Whiteman to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you all for coming. It is a pleasure to join Meredith in welcoming you to this, our second 2026 Frank Davis Memorial Lecture Series, tonight delivered by Dr. Benjamin Zweig. Trained as a medievalist with a dissertation on representations of suicide in medieval art from Boston University, Dr. Zweig has forged a scholarly and professional career along parallel paths. As a medievalist, twin paths, let's say, often intersecting. A medievalist, of course, but also as one of the leading thinkers in the emerging critical historiography of computational methods in art and architectural history. I first met Dr. Zweig in 2014 when we were both fellows at the Crest Summer Institute in Digital Art History at Middlebury College in Vermont. That autumn, he joined the National Gallery of Art, first as the Robert H. Smith Postdoctoral Research Fellow in Digital Art History at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, or CASVA, and subsequently as the gallery's Digital Projects Coordinator, serving a total of 9 years in Washington. Bless you for surviving. In 2023, he moved to his current position as Digital Projects Manager at Columbia University Libraries, while also teaching at the Pratt Institute, the School of Art and Design in New York City. On the medieval side, Dr. Zweig continues his work across a range of subjects in Scandinavian medievalism, publishing articles on images and architecture, and on their subsequent collection and display in the modern world. On the digital front, he has sought to think through the implications of big, or at least bigger, data on the field of art history, revisiting core art historical methods and ideas, the roots of art history and approaches such as formalism, in light of the digital turn. It is on this front that he will speak this evening in a lecture entitled, "What Has Riegl Got to Do with the Perceptron?" Exploring the place of art historical method in computer vision. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Zweig.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. It's a real honor. It's lovely to be back at the Courtauld. Last time I was here, you hadn't moved here yet, so that's how long it's been since I've been here. And thank you very much for being a part of this excellent series amongst a really impressive set of speakers. So my talk tonight is entitled, What Has Riegl to Do with the Perceptron? Exploring the place of art historical method in computer vision. So I'd just like to begin, and I'm actually very glad that Professor Whiteman mentioned my medieval background, because as a medievalist by training, I actually never passed an opportunity to bring up the pre-modern world, and the title is exactly that. Some audiences, some of audience members might know what has Riegl to do with the perceptron is my unsubtle nod to the famous question posed by the early Christian scholar Tertullian, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? This question is, of course, not geographic, but of knowledge and the process of knowing. Athens represents one tradition of knowledge, Jerusalem another. But these two cities are also foundations for knowledge, both in competition and in concert with one another. Like all metaphors, this one is imperfect, but it's been on my mind thinking about the relationship between art history and computer vision in the current moment, and especially over the past few weeks. For I think what we are seeing, and what we have been seeing for some years, in fact, is more or less this dynamic. Two cities of knowledge, each encountering the other awkwardly, hesitantly, yet still with a curiosity that there is something to be gained from this encounter. So what I'd like to do this evening, however briefly, is to unpack this encounter a bit. What I want to do is to look at the dynamic not from a technical or a prescriptive point of view, that is, what can computer vision do for art history, or how a model has been used in a collection, of which there are plenty of excellent examples, but from one that is descriptive of historiography and method, the cities and their foundations. In the summer of 2024, just last summer, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia hosted a 2-day symposium, Computer Vision and Art History Today. The results were published shortly thereafter in the journal The Art Bulletin under a special section entitled Art History After Computer Vision. The convener, Elizabeth Mansfield, notes in her follow-up essay that, quote, research projects that apply computer vision to the history of art are already abundant, though relatively few involve art historians. I feel like this is a partially true statement. Yes, there are many, many computer vision projects that use art as their object of inquiry, but most of these projects, if I may generalize, are not actually interested in the history of art in so much as they are interested in using a set of images that happen to fall under the subject art. To Mansfield's second point, I think this is right, but not because of lack of interest. For example, in 2018, the Frick Collection in New York hosted a 2-day symposium entitled Searching Through Seeing, Optimizing Computer Vision for the Arts. The symposium brought together art historians, computer scientists, and industry figures in order to assess the use of computer vision for art history and museum collections. The announcement for the symposium came with this qualifier, quote, in recent years, computer vision technology has been adopted in many areas, yet surprisingly, it has not reached its full potential for curators, dealers, artists, and academics who work with images on a daily basis. What full potential means here is an open question. And I'm also not sure why this lack of full potential should in fact be surprising. But it in many ways connects to the theme of this year's Davis lecture, Art History, Fire at the Crossroads of Computer Vision. Further, digital art history is by now a well-established field within art history. And there is no shortage of projects and approaches one could talk about. Visual resources in particular has been one. The one on the left, obscure, is from 2005, so it's actually a really long run field. In regards to computer vision and art history, perhaps the most common application has been on analyzing digital collections and photo archives in order to foster discovery, searching, and metadata generation, such as the Composito and Pharos projects, This artresearch.net is a Ferris project, of which I believe the Cornwall is a member. If anyone's interested in this, it actually has a lot of computer vision things underneath. Like that stuff, which I think you do since you're here. Second to this application, for what we might better call technical art history, such as weave counting, pigment and paper analysis, materials, and so forth. Thirdly, there have been numerous more analytical studies and applications. Peter Bell, this is work here, Peter Bell's examination of gestures in Italian Renaissance paintings, as well as the 13th century gestural work in the Sachsenspiegel, Mansfield's examination of Constable's clouds, and too many others to name here. Bill, I think we need a spreadsheet. We can all work together in the spirit of collaboration. Yet something I've actually been struck by, and quite honestly struggling with in thinking through this, is computer vision's direct engagement with art historical method, the precise procedures and acts of interpretation for art history to happen. I am not alone. In 2023, Amanda Vasilevsky published the book Computational Formalism, which brought more fully to light something that has long been noted. That computer vision approaches to the history of art have brought a renewed engagement with a very specific kind of art history, mainly that of formalism. Indeed, if there is one thing that art historians seem to agree on regarding computer vision and art history, either as a critique or an opportunity, is that it has brought a renewed interest, for better or worse, into the tenets of formalism and dialogue with foundational thinkers in art history. Giovanni Morelli, Alois Riegl, Heinrich Wolfflin, Avi Warburg, Erwin Panofsky, and so on. Similarly, a state of the field essay on computer vision and art history notes, quote, early art history methods regard only the visual aspects of artworks, and thus they are easier for computer scientists to comprehend and define as computer vision problems based on low-level image features. This is not by an art historian, because an art historian wouldn't speak that way. This is by a computer scientist looking for art history. In fact, a historiographic survey by Anna Neslund, who will be here in a few weeks, finds that all through digital art history and computer vision literature, there's a strong focus on formalism and iconography, and that Panofsky, as a reference point, is a terminus ante quem in much of the field. It doesn't really go beyond him. But some of the similarities between computer vision and formalism have brought out a somewhat uncritical reflexivity about our own discipline. For example, Vasilevsky's claim that, quote, early art historians, the foundational figures of the discipline, were taxonomists in a similar vein to computer vision researchers. I don't think this is true for art history or for computer science. In fact, it's probably more true for archaeology than anything else. We're looking for an analog. So, with that said, let me try to unpack this a bit. The perceptron and the foundations of computer vision. All disciplines have their origins or genealogies, the assumptions that make them work. In computer vision and art history, one is likely to hear terms such as neural network, convolutional neural network, deep convolutional neural network, image segmentation, feature detection, feature extraction, and more recently, contrastive image language pre-training, or CLIP, and vision transformer. And if anyone can define those terms, it's not easy. But underlying the foundations for all these terms and all these methods that underscore computer vision algorithms is the perceptron. On July 7th, 1958, Frank Rosenblatt, a behavioral psychologist working under a grant from U.S. Naval Research at Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in Buffalo, New York, presented his work on the perceptron algorithm. Based on the idea of an artificial neuron, first proposed in the 1940s, Rosenblatt demonstrated what was the first artificial neural network, a binary classifier system modeled on the human brain. And you can see here at the top is their brain diagram, and at the bottom is actually how they've taken what they thought were the neurological components for vision and basically how the computer is supposed to work. The perceptron, especially by today's standard, was quite simple, no matter how this looks. It took a single input, and through a system of computed weights and a threshold, it produced a binary output of 0 or 1 based upon a pre-trained data set that claimed to be based like this on the human brain. Basically, you put one thing in and it says, is that the thing it thinks it is, yes or no? In short, it was an early but foundational step in image or object sorting and recognition. Indeed, its purpose was to be able to sort through thousands of images that were actually connected to military surveillance, especially in seeing if things like regiments, tanks, platoons, battalions were moving based on aerial surveillance. And here it is kind of as it works. It's very, very large. It still exists. It's at the American Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian. You see on the left we have a camera, and basically each section of this corresponds to the algorithm, and each section of this basically corresponds to a modeling of the human brain and kind of layers of actually perceiving one thing to the next. In 1960, the Rosenblatt presented the perceptron as a complete system on this, the Mark I computer, that generated considerable press and breathless claims that a machine that thinks just like a human was right around the corner. Yeah, I hear you laugh because I think this is very much of the moment, right? So the intelligent automation, there's something wonderfully like retro about the one on the left especially, but introducing the perceptron, machine which senses, recognizes, remembers, and responds like the human mind. So it has a long history. And the electronic brain teaches itself. So all of this was to be done within a year, and basically we were supposed to have autonomous thinking machines in 1959. So while the perceptron actually marked a major achievement, its actual immediate success was limited. The recognition of discrete objects within photographs proved computationally difficult. Government funding dried up. The 1969 book, Perceptrons, An Introduction to Computational Geometry, presented a severe critique of Rosenblatt's work. Rosenblatt himself died in a boating accident in 1971 at the age of 43. Nonetheless, the perceptron actually laid the foundations for the development of the neural network architecture for image processing, including convolutional neural networks. There are basic techniques for filtering, segmenting images, especially for object detection. And has anyone actually heard that term, convolutional neural networks, when we talk about this? Some have. Yeah, if you actually wonder, there's a lot of this kind of very technical jargon with this work. Well, basically, just like the perceptron tries to match a single image kind of through a layer, a convolutional neural network does the same, just with many layers. And it takes an image and it basically divides it into sections, and it puts them, each section is like a class as a layer and a classifier. And this kind of is a pretty good diagram of it, of how it works, or just kind of what the machine is actually doing. And so when you actually put an image through a lot of object recognition software, this is what it's doing. You put an image in, it grids it, it puts it through that network, and it basically has this kind of result, right? Sky, sky, bird, bird, etc. So if you ever put in an object and you get bounding boxes and it says this is like a tree or something, this is actually what's happening underneath it. At the same time, in 1973, the researchers Fischler and Elschlager proposed the concept of pictorial structures for facial recognition. The idea was that there were specific generalizable features that could be modeled: hair, eyes, nose, mouth, and the left and right side of the face. To make this application useful, each feature is connected via a spring so that it can incorporate variabilities and relationships and be used as a kind of stretchy template. Yeah, so if you're wondering why the springs are there, it's because early computer vision, basically, if it wasn't an exact match, it couldn't read it. If it was at a different angle, the computer couldn't read it. If it was at a different size, it couldn't read it. Elshlag and Fisher created the idea of springs, which leads to this thing called deformity, which is basically why if a face is longer or shorter, thinner or wider, it can read it. But before then, it actually wasn't something that was quite possible. So Elshlag wrote that, quote, "Many, though by no means all, visual objects can be described by breaking down the object into a number or more of primitive parts, and by specifying an allowable range of spatial relationships, linear geometry or linear algebra. With these primitive parts, they must satisfy for the object to be present." So this is the kind of template. So the perceptron and pictorial structures, she provided some of the building blocks for computer vision as part of its golden era of the 1950s through the 1970s, before diving into the so-called AI winter of the 1980s and 1990s, just an example of kind of the actual history and trajectory of computer vision a bit. So the techniques actually developed during this golden age, neural networks, object detection, line segmentation, and edge detection, were here to stay. But so has the biological metaphor for computer vision as a kind of brain, as a kind of seeing. Rosenblatt himself wrote in his 1962 book, Principles of Neurodynamics, that, quote, "A perceptron is first and foremost a brain model, not an invention for pattern recognition." No matter their intention to be rooted in biology and psychology, both the perceptron and pictorial structures were effectively abstract solutions to abstract problems. The process for locating objects within images, by which we really mean photographs, required such abstractions to be useful. The complexities of the images themselves required an extensive process of data reduction, color, size, line, and so on. As such, these abstractions presented the foundations of an operative machine formalism. So, what then happened when these foundations were, and continue to be, consciously or not, put to use by art historians in relation to the specific methodologies of our discipline? So Morelli's ghost, computational connoisseurship. In computer vision projects for the history of art, by both art historians and computer scientists, the name of the 19th century Italian Giovanni Morelli in his 1892 handbook, Italian Painters, Critical Studies of Their Works, as well as the term connoisseurship, frequently appear. This is especially evidenced by the computer scientist David Stork's recent book, Pixels and Paintings, from 2023. Indeed, one of the pioneering projects in digital art history actually bears the name of Morelli. It was in the mid-1980s when William Vaughan, an art historian of Birkbeck College here in London, began working on the Morelli project, software that sought to find alike images in a database, primarily those of Rembrandt, although here is one of Van Dyck. This doesn't exist anymore, but this is from the mid-1980s, and it's got that kind of wonderful look, especially choose one to return and all of that. So if you like that kind of stuff, it's press the button, it's very cool. But yes, this is effectively the earliest kind of Morellian image matching program developed specifically by an art historian. It's it'd be great if it still worked.
Do you know what language?
I don't know. No, but they might be mentioned somewhere in their documentation. Sorry. The system was actually described in literature as a, quote, automated connoisseur. In reality, it was a large-scale image matching program finding known objects within a controlled environment. It actually operated much more at the level of the Perceptron than at the level of Italian painters. Indeed, Vaughan himself seemed to have reservations over the name as something of a misnomer. Nonetheless, the name stuck. It was really a name of convenience. Why call it Morelli or describe it as a computational connoisseur? What is at stake here in these decisions? Giovanni Morelli, as I'm sure everyone here might know, proposed that symptomatic or involuntary clues could be read to identify an artist on an unsigned piece or by a workshop or of a forger, the Morellian method. His famous examples were the shapes of hands and ears. With an up-close looking, he argued one could use these clues and traces to come to a safe logical attribution. Of course, connoisseurship well predates Morelli, especially as a kind of gentleman's pursuit ripe for parody. But his chief contribution was to try to replace the subjectiveness of taste and judgment with a, quote, objective method as a way to validate his approach and famously wage his battle against German academic art history. So why Morelli and why connoisseurship? The answer is fairly straightforward. He proposes a clear organizational method. Like the connoisseur when it comes to the history of art, computers make propositions based on determined thresholds and similarity of formal elements. This hand looks like that hand. This ear looks like that ear. It's template matching at its finest, which is actually a specific computer vision technique, by the way. If the purpose behind computer vision is to assess similarity and support discovery, to see alike things, then no wonder connoisseurship as an analogous practice seems appealing. But the problem with the foundations of generalized formality continues to haunt, because what is often the result, especially in a lot of computer vision projects still, is less this specific ear looks like that specific ear, and more that ear also looks like an ear. If you notice it, right, you'll know what I'm talking about. It doesn't say that ear, it's like that's an ear and so is that, and that's also an ear, and that's what you get with a lot of them. So let's take a look at a recent project that actually tried to operationalize the Morellian method. Beginning in 2017, a series of projects at the University of Pittsburgh by a team of art historians, Christopher Nygren and Alison Langmead, and computer scientists, have actually attempted to explore connoisseurship and what style actually means in relation. In one project specifically, the Morelli machine, they attempted to take Morelli's method and turn it into an algorithm and test its actual limits when human judgment was removed. That is, unsupervised learning, they called it, through a computational mirror. They concluded with the following. It is an unavoidable truth that computers have not earned their place in the conversation about artistic attribution, because the linkage between style and authorship is not some immutable law of physics that is easily computable, but rather a humanistic commitment that requires human judgment. Indeed, the results were in many ways the opposite of Morelli. They were broad-scale generalizations. They were bins of extracted maps, but there were no actual attributions. And this is from their project, and it's like really terrifying. You see it all together, so I'm going to move on. But what I actually found fascinating about Nygren and Langmead's project, aside from engaging directly with humanistic methodology, is that it actually points to something particularly interesting, and that is the genealogy of vision they're encountering here is actually not Morelli. And I should point out, and I hope if I can take this quickly, I don't know if you can see it, but can everyone see it actually in this image? There's a red line here, and that's actually the bounding box, and you can see the way that the face is kind of segmented. You see a mouth, you see nose, you see eyes. And I don't know how well that comes up here. But it's because the genealogy of vision they're encountering here is not Morelli's. the genealogy of vision they're actually encountering here is Elschlager and Fischler's. It's the picture primitives that's undergirding this. It's a fundamentally different way of seeing that for all their surface similarity, in fact, treat form and objects in very different ways. This is anti-Morellian vision. And I don't think that we should underestimate the practical frictions caused by competing histories of what it means to see, as their project well demonstrates. From the computer vision side, the most vocal proponent for the success of computational connoisseurship has been David Stork, who in 2009 had already pronounced that, quote, in some cases, these computer methods are more accurate than highly trained connoisseurs, art historians, and artists. He states, quote, such automated methods provide new tools for connoisseurs and art scholars and have resolved art historical debates that proved resistant to traditional art historical methods. None of this is true. What Stork is talking about specifically there is actually David Hockney's assertion on optical devices being used as early as the 15th century. But his insistence stands more broadly. But nowhere does Stork actually mention in any of his work what these, quote, traditional art historical methods in fact are, which is surprising given that he retreats to connoisseurship as art historical practice in the first place. Art historical methods are taken just as some kind of nebulous tradition to be proven computationally inadequate. He continues, quote, computer vision analysis has automated several tasks traditionally performed by connoisseurs and art historians, such as the analysis of composition and landscapes, of brushstrokes and other marks, of canvas weave, lighting, and general properties of style. That's a lot for one person. I don't think this remark, or really most of Stork's remarks, are quite true. As I've argued elsewhere, such pronouncements seem to me not so much looking for art historical methods as guides, as much as the closest point of validation for computer science's own methods. Stork likes Morelli not because Morelli is right, but because Morelli is familiar. It is an understanding of our history as wholly concerned with identification, attribution, dating, and style. It is the vision of the art historian as statistician. And in contrast to such lofty expectations for computational connoisseurship, the recent assessment by the Frans Hals project in the Netherlands presents a sobering rebuttal. Quote, although various computer programs have been developed with more ambitious goals, namely to substitute the connoisseur's analysis of brushstrokes or overall visual assessment, these have not been proven to be effective in practice. By contrast, algorithms with more modest goals, namely simply facilitating comparisons, have a powerful impact on the field. Thus, we're still reckoning with Morelli, though this time it is Bond's analogous machine and less the man. So, speaking of Frans Hals, my favorite segue, if there is a method within the realm, I'm going to use it every time now. Don't want to have a conversation, speaking of Frans Hals. If there is a method within the realm of connoisseurship that is even more computational or algorithmic than Morelli, it is the system of Pictology, created by the Dutch economist turned artist Maurits van Dantzig. In the 1930s, Van Dantzig developed a methodology based on a set of secure attributions to the work of Frans Hals that included 44 traits he considered characteristic of the artist: line, color, composition, material, texture, etc. He applied this criteria to 116 works of art attributed to Hals, coming to the conclusion that 33 were authentic, 5 doubtful, 42 wrongly attributed, and 36 forgeries. Van Dantzig's list of features would grow from 44 to 146 just for Frans Hals, and extended to Leonardo, Van Gogh, and Raphael. Using Van Dantzig's checklist, one would be able to get a quantitatively determined result And you see here on the right, this is how the entire book is actually structured. And you see how, unlike Morelli, Dantzig actually says like this arch of the eyebrow is yes, no. Is it Leonardo? Does it look like this? Then no. So it's extremely kind of like computationally like thought through. The closeness of Van Dantzig's Pictology as akin to Computational was noted quite amazingly in 1977 by Gary Schwartzman in a review of the posthumously published book Pictology in an issue of Art News. According to Schwartzman, quote, "Studying it, Pictology, I sense that what Van Dantzig had in mind was a kind of program connoisseurship, working with criteria that do not differ in kind from those employed by connoisseurs and critics. He lined them up rigorously, found ways of measuring them, and suggested how one might draw conclusions from their systematic application." Indeed, reading Van Dantzig's Pictology actually reminds me more than anything of pseudocode. If anyone knows what pseudocode is, it's a kind of mix between natural language and actually writing out algorithms. But it's a real attempt to transform human and artistic practice into an algorithm. And you can basically see on the right, by the sense that he uses plus and minus signs for things. So if you add up this piece and this piece and this piece, but you get to a certain point, you take it away, where does it lead you? It's basically an if-else statement in programming. So it's very like thought through, right? You're led to kind of know, you're led to things very quickly. Recent work by computer scientist Ahmed Al-Gamal from Rutgers University has actually attempted, again, to operationalize, I'm very sorry for using that word, but there's no better word, Van Dantzig's Pictology as part of an attribution system he has created to determine real drawings from fake ones. So one reason why Pictology is attractive is because Van Dantzig presents features at the detail level of line, stroke, and width. So you see on the right, the one at the top is from Frans Hals apparently, and the one at the bottom are Van Dantzig's own versions of Frans Hals. He's basically trying to show how you could get away with the kind of lines, although they don't quite look like exactly the way, but there's also a reason for that. So his method, like the foundations of computer vision, is entirely based on the extreme reduction of information, and the one most akin to computational data, computational ready data like discrete tokens or glyphs that serve computational textual studies so well. But curiously, one of the features of Van Dantzig's Pictology for determining if an artwork was authentic was through spontaneity, which is also the key operator for Al-Gamal's proof of whether a drawing is authentic or not. This is Al-Gamal's whole process for how he's actually using Pictology, feeding the system, how it runs. The problem with Pictology is that it assumes a consistency in artistic practice that rarely, if ever, exists. And consistent spontaneity is even harder to quantify. Van Dantzig himself showed that he considered the spontaneity of the original stroke with his own copy. I'll just go back. So that's what he's trying to do, is basically he's doing something kind of interesting. He's both showing how he could forge it, but also what you should be looking for in a forgery. So he's trying to do several things here at once. Actually, the most trenchant critique of Van Dantzig's work was actually brought up by the historian Van Gelder in the 1980s. Quote, "Did Frans Hals paint in one style all his life? Perhaps the painter evolved, applied different styles, and also occasionally made mistakes. Thus, when we take something like Pictology, how much consistency should we expect? How much variety? How does one decide how far departures in practice are actually identified as copies, fakes, and forgeries? How does Al-Gamal's use of Pictology here count these facts of history? The short answer is they don't. Whether, quote, the validity and effectiveness of Van Dantzig's method is independent of the practitioner, is the promise here of computer-assisted certainties, or just another case of garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, present in 1988. These are questions still worth asking, especially in light of Algamo's project and the somewhat paradoxical promise of objective connoisseurship. So before I move on, I'd like to make just a couple quick remarks about connoisseurship. I think this will all sound very familiar to everyone. But why its invocation in computer vision in the history of art is such a thorny problem. First, connoisseurship, whether of the Morelli or Dantzig variety or some other kind, is not immutable proof. Rather, it is a proposition based on form and judgment. And the propositions it raises might lead to a particularistic conjectural knowledge based on grades of intuition as much as anything that can be considered objective. The slippery slope with computer vision as a type of connoisseurship is that its propositions become evidence for its own proof. Second, the connoisseurial methods ostensibly analogous for computer vision were created not by art historians, but by a physician-turned-connoisseur in Morelli and an economist-turned-artist in Dantzig. What we see today with projects like this are scientific methods that were interpolated into art history that then, unsurprisingly, resurface when these methods validate the foundational models of computer vision itself. Wolfflin's categories as bins. So if Morelli and Pictology, perceptrons, and picture primitives were not enough, we'll move on to the minor scholar Heinrich Wolfflin and his rather obscure book, Principles of Art History. So like Morelli and Dantzig, there is something prima facie about Wolfflin that lends itself to a kind of ersatz computational analogy. Pictorial categories of linear painterly, planar recessional, open-closed, absolute relative clarity, and multiplicity unity. They seem primed to be reformulated as an if-else statement. So Algamo, whom we just met through his project on Pictology, actually put this computational reformulation of Wolfflin to practice in his 2018 project, The Shape of Art History in the Eyes of the Machine. Algamo sought to use Wolfflin's categories with the claim that the computer could, quote, place works of art in a smooth temporal arrangement, mainly based on learning style labels. The dataset consisted of 81,449 paintings from WikiArt, you know that one. Sculpture and photography were excluded. The dataset was then split into training, validation, and testing groups. In his writing, Algamo's enthused that the machine identified certain artists as representatives for styles or periods, Albrecht Dürer for Northern Renaissance, or Monet for Impressionism, and that the result was, quote, in his words, a smooth temporal evolution of style without any knowledge of dates. But I'm not sure this shows what he claims. And the achievement strikes me, especially reading the project, as a byproduct of using style labels to organize the data. The visualizations produced group together similar artworks using the labels, and then a chronology is inferred after the fact. When style labels are applied to images and used computationally, they're going to have a temporal dimension to them just naturally because styles are inherently rooted in time. So it's a bit of an overstatement of, I think, what his project actually did. Well, let us look at the rationale for using Wolfflin at all. Quote, we chose, this is Algamo, we chose Wolfflin's theory because of his emphasis on formal discriminative features, probably sounds very familiar from computer vision now, and the compare-contrast logic of his system, qualities that make it conducive to machine learning. I, for one, actually genuinely appreciate this sentence and its clear rationale for using Wolfflin. But the same questions arise that we encountered with Morelli when our historical method is turned into an algorithm. Wolfflin's categories were not, and never meant to be, an immutable classificatory system. As Catherine Brown noticed recently, Wolfflin's work is a foundational text and has spurred interesting debates in both art history and aesthetics. But a classificatory apparatus posited in the Principles of Art History is not one to which art historians would typically turn today. She states further, quote, "The bare isolation and extraction of features from the surface of a work does not in itself give an accurate picture of what might be described as either general or individual styles of painting." This is very much true. And it is also very much not what Wolfflin proposes in principles either. Wolfflin notes about his pairings that, quote, "If we are not mistaken, the development can be reduced as a provisional formulation to the following 5 pairs of concepts." As such, the 5 pairings were never meant to be a checklist for taxonomic categorization, linear in bucket A, painterly in bucket B, etc. Rather, they were guidelines for understanding the history of perception and vision, an account of how artists represent their world. What Wolfflin was ultimately interested as well as in how these components meet at the peak point of an object in unity, in the whole picture. This is, in fact, why it has proven much more difficult than expected, along with many disappointing results, to, quote, "operationalize Wolfflin." It is a seductive idea to think that one can create a histogram based on principles. How many paintings are linear? How many paintings are painterly? What does the distribution tell us? Binning history. I had mentioned that with computational connoisseurship, the danger lies in using propositions as evidence for proof. The same goes for trying to computationally validate Wolfflin's categories. So here's an example. For example, in this one project, inspired by Algamo as it seems, sought to use a convolutional neural network, everyone knows what it looks like now, to create a model that would discriminate images based on Wolfflin's pairings. Another very recent project sought to create a clip model that, quote, "learns to predict contrasting Wolfflin's principles that could then be deployed as a product." I'm going to talk about this in 1 second. I just found it today, actually, and it was extraordinarily fortuitous. But my criticism for projects like these is that Wolfflin is not and never was a predictive model. Morelli and connoisseurship, perhaps to some degree, but to use Wolfflin in this way, I think misuses him rather egregiously. It gives his principles the undue weight of objective natural law. More than that, his categories become self-fulfilling, predetermined that work backwards to validate the result. So this, I actually didn't know this was here until today. I found it by the National Institutes of Health, of all things. And if you go up to the website, I'm very torn about sending you there, but this is a project that actually asks you to rate images it shows you based on Wolfflin's categories, which I found extremely wild. And what's worse about it, because it does get worse, is, I promise you it gets way worse, is that these are actually being used for a generative AI model that is then to be used to basically say, show me a Wolfflin-like image. Show me a painterly image, show me a linear image based on this. So this is an example of this.
If you ask that from art historian, they probably the value.
Maybe, but the thing is that's basically asking anybody.
That's the problem.
So the challenges of Riegl. So finally, and perhaps blessedly, let me turn to Alois Riegl. Like Morelli and Wolfflin, the Viennese art historian Riegl seems to pop up in many mentions of computer vision and art history, especially if we consider computer vision as a neo-formalist project. Then Riegl is mentioned everywhere. One finds his name as part of a kind of triptych. Morelli in the center, Wolfflin in the left wing, Riegl on the right. Even the cover of Vasilevsky's Computational Formalism seems to nod to Riegl and Riegl's The Group Portraiture of Holland. This is not wholly unexpected, for Riegl is very much a formalist in some sense of the word. It's focused on surface, texture, and the morphology of form over time. His impact on the history of art as a distinct discipline is profound, with concepts such as Stilltragen, Kunstwollen, haptic optic that cannot be overstated in their impact and subsequent reactions. I myself have asked the question, if there might be an alternative art historical model for exploiting computer vision's formalist workings, and my tentative answer has been Riegl. Yet one is actually extremely hard-pressed to find Riegl operationalized in the same way as Morelli and Wolfflin, or even Avi Warburg. Why is this? I have several theories, but the one I actually come back to the most after asking this question again and again is simply that Riegl, in fact, defies being operationalized as those two, or even as Warburg or Panofsky could be. Computational neo-formalism does not fit neatly into his theories, and so Riegl remains more of an indexical reference point for the return of formalism than anything else. Indeed, how can qualities such as haptic and optic, those based on the sensuality of touch that turns towards vision, be used in computer vision? How can a computer detect a work's Stimmung, or organic and crystalline form? Can late Roman art industry be transformed into an algorithm in the same way Italian painters with Pictology? Or, for all the money, can Kunstwollen be computationally proven? I'm not convinced they can, because these are human judgments that mostly resist quantification. And contrary to his somewhat reductionist reputation, Riegl was far more than a formalist, and was certainly not a taxonomist in the vein of computer vision researchers. What is true, Riegl adopted empirical methods, close looking and attention to form. This was only one part of a larger project that sought to move from the tactile to Kunstwollen to Weltanschauung. It's hard to read Riegl and come away with the impression that he was simply interested in organizing things. The question for us as art historians who are still interested in the application of computer vision is, what role does he actually have in it, if any? For me, as I've proposed elsewhere, Riegl's value lies not in any one method, but in some of the questions he's posed that might be answered computationally, namely Stillfragen and the history of ornaments. How we get there and what that looks like, fortunately, that is a topic for another time. So I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, since I heard some disappointments. To conclude, because I'm sure I've gone on long enough. So I must thank you all for staying with me this far. The Tuesday night, especially having an art historian talk about convolutional neural networks, sounds like a ridiculous thing, but here we are. I'd like to submit a bit of a defense of art history in the face of computer vision, especially in the ways that I've kind of seen it used, and come back to my initial question of what has Riegl to do with the perceptron. I don't think I've actually satisfactorily answered this, and in good humanistic tradition, I'm not sure I actually can. Indeed, from my brief foray into Riegl himself, seems like the direct answer to this question is, in fact, not a whole lot. I think this is because we still don't know as well as we should what the foundational models of art history have to do with the foundational models of machine vision. Yet I think the question still has value for the following reasons. It asks, what are the foundational pieces, the assumptions of knowledge and practice, that are in effect when computer vision is put towards art history, especially with the claim that it is somehow a new formalism in an art historical tradition. While this comparison was also my initial reaction, I've become less convinced of this. I don't think it's wrong per se. I don't think that we can deny that computer vision is indeed a formalist endeavor, but its genealogy lies elsewhere, with the simple neuroformalism of the perceptron and the picture primitives of Elschlager and Fishman. The second part of my question, as I've thought about it, is that the attempts to graft on art historical methods because they seem good analogs for the mechanics of computer vision will have diminishing returns. Thus, if analogs are all that we asked for, this program is like Morelli in this way, this program is like Wolfflin in this way, etc. Perhaps we'll have to be satisfied with that. And we'll be satisfied with computer vision of the digitized variety of digital art history. I don't actually think this is necessarily a bad thing at all, and it might be where we end up. But in his essay, Digital Art History as Critical AI, from the series of our bulletin essays I mentioned at the beginning, Leonardo Impet notes how the small trickle of work which attempts to cross machine vision with art history has struggled to make any real impact on the rest of the discipline. If Impet is correct here, and I think he is mostly, One reason is because art historians and computer scientists have been looking for the nearest points of disciplinary convergence, namely formalism, that simply haven't borne the promised analytical fruit in a way that was imagined as inevitable back in 2018 at the Frick Symposium. That somehow the calls for collaboration between art historians and computer scientists were going to result in a new observer whose stereoscopic vision was left eye art history, right eye computer science. Thank you.